Let's take a look at the basic structure of a risk assessment first filter that can be administered across an organization in a survey, either facilitated in a group session or completed by individuals online. In administering a survey-like risk assessment first filter, the first step is to identify the participants in the risk assessment, and the second step would be to set the scope of the risk assessment. In this example, we see we're identifying the template user and the subject matter experts who will participate in the risk assessment. We've also included the key stakeholders and approvers. Those would be the individuals who would look at the output of the risk assessment and specifically the 3 risk grids. We'll also set the scope of the risk assessment. This is an example of a supply chain scope. Of course, the categories for scoping depends on the organization performing the risk assessment. The categories will be important to enable risk aggregation and risk pooling by, let's say, indication in this case, or by drug product, or combinations of these scoping parameters. We'll use up to 7 or so framing questions to ensure a comprehensive perspective is adopted by the involved subject matter experts. This is an example of a framing question related to raw material supply. And so for every risk associated with raw material supply, we'd like the following information: a brief risk description, a short name for the risk. These will be labels for our risk grids, any current existing controls, any approved or funded risk mitigation actions yet to be fully implemented, and lastly, we'd like to document any suggested additional risk mitigation actions. I'm now going to introduce a likely improvement to your current probability assessment approach. For each of the identified risks, we will assess the probability of risk occurrence over the defined time horizon, and once again in this example, we'll be using a 5-year time horizon. The overall approach and scale is based on our cognitive strengths and biases in estimating uncertainty. The first step in assessing the probability of occurrence is to specify the time windows in which the risk might occur. We'll simply check the time windows in which the risk might occur: within the next 12 months, 2 to 3 years from now, and or 4 or more years from now, which in this case means in the 4th or 5th year, given our 5-year time horizon. For most risks, we think best in terms of the probability of risk occurrence within a 12-month or annualized time period. In fact, much of the data on probability of risk occurrence you can collect will be annualized, such as annualized failure rates on equipment or likelihood of a hurricane or earthquake. Importantly, our intuition and judgment typically underestimates the compounding impact of the probability of risk occurrence over multiple years. So it's best to do this calculation mathematically rather than leave it to subjective estimation. And to be precise, we need to calculate the probability of the risk occurring at least once within the time horizon to replace the sometimes ill-defined or ambiguous statement of probability of risk occurrence. The irregular intervals are designed to better align with our abilities to contemplate and assess probability, as opposed to the common approach of equal length intervals. And now we'll assess the consequences and impacts given a risk occurs. For each risk, we'll simply indicate as to whether there is a safety or compliance concern, and then document what that concern is with language, not numbers. As for the measures we choose to quantify, we will use a simple range assessment based on a surprisingly low and a surprisingly high range. In this example, we're using downtime months and total cost impacts over a 5-year time horizon. Here's one example of how to assess revenue impacts at a first filter level of detail. Remember, we want to keep this simple. And once again, for startup companies without revenue or a sales forecast, we can use time delay to product launch as a surrogate measure for revenue impact. But for companies that do have revenue streams or a sales forecast will first need to identify which products or services will have lost revenue given the risk occurs. And for each product and service impacted, would have to detail which sales regions are impacted, the month's duration of the lost revenue impact, and again we're going to use a surprisingly low and surprisingly high range assessment to specify the percentage of lost revenue for each one of those months the risk impact occurs. The risk assessment's second filter is applied to the subset of risks and opportunities that require significant investment and consequently should require a return on investment calculation, or what I like to call an investment productivity measure. Watch the video on the 5 questions of Pro Enterprise Management to understand the insights that are generated by a risk assessment second filter.